Shalom, family. This is me, Mary C., coming to you yet again with another video. And this time around, this video is entitled Road to War. Will the U.S. draft be reinstated? So, you know what? Before I get going on this, let me share with you some of the headline news articles that are current. Let me start with this one here. Russia plans to annex 4 regions in Ukraine. The next one reads, Nord Stream pipeline hit by suspicious leaks and possible sabotage. Russia says it has a right to use nuclear weapons. The next one reads, NATO warns Russia of severe consequences in case of a nuclear strike. The next one reads, German imperialism is gearing up for World War III. Followed by this headline, chilling map shows World War III could decimate entire planet in horror nuclear winter. And that one is followed by World War III is coming. And another, World War III already underway, claims Belarus. And that one is followed by this one. Trump warns of World War III over Ukraine. And watch what happens with China and Taiwan. And the final one that I'm going to share with you is this. 2 days ago, this is what was in the headlines 2 days ago. And it was from Must Read Alaska, if you want to look it up. And it starts like this. Breaking. Coast Guard encounters Chinese missile cruisers and Russian naval vessels in single formation in U.S. Bering Sea. It was a total of 3 Chinese vessels and 4 Russian vessels that participated. And these are the current headlines that are in our news feeds today. So I just wanted to bring those to you to just open up this discussion on this road to war. Will the United States draft be reinstated? Something to ponder as you watch the rest of this video.
Right now, military recruiting is going forward as normal. The military is an all-volunteer force with about 1.2 million active duty troops.
The Selective Service website crashed, and the Army is having to calm fears. Rumors about a military draft have left a lot of people worried about what could be next. So what's going on? Caroline Vandergriff in Fort Worth tonight to separate fact from fiction for everybody. Caroline?
World War III started trending on social media, and then misinformation spread like wildfire. But the draft hasn't been in effect since 1973.
The rumors about a possible draft have just exploded.
From texts to tweets, we've seen growing fears about an upcoming military draft.
There's tons of people who are extremely concerned about it. A lot of people think it'll be World War III.
All men from 18 to 25 years old are required to register with the Selective Service System, and they have been for decades.
The Selective Service System that we have actually just puts young men's names in a database, and that's it. There is no draft.
And it's unlikely there will be one anytime soon. Congress would have to pass legislation reinstating the draft, and the president would have to sign it.
You'd have to get Republicans and Democrats all agree on something like this, and frankly, I don't see it happening.
UNT political science professor James Miernick says while people don't need to worry about a potential draft, they should be concerned about what happens next.
The U.S. military is facing a growing recruiting shortfall, a shortfall so large that legislators are getting concerned.
The Army has to recognize that there's been an evolution in that young population, and if you're going to target that young population for service, you've got to make it appealing to them.
The pool of potential recruits has been dropping for years.
So the three biggest reasons for a small pool of eligible recruits are criminal backgrounds, healthcare and obesity specifically, and financial issues.
The Army and the other military services this year are facing what they're describing as the most challenging recruiting environment since the all-volunteer force era began in 1973.
The latest figures show that only about 23% of young men and women in the United States meet the criteria to join, whether that's physical fitness, health, criminal background check.
Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are obviously very concerned about the military's recruitment efforts because this is coming at a time where Russia's war in Ukraine is changing global order, as well as China saber-rattling with Taiwan and in the South China Sea.
When unemployment is low, the military struggles to get recruits. And with unemployment hovering around 3.5%, it can be tough to convince young people to sign up. The fiscal year for the U.S. Army ends in September, and the Army has only reached 50% of its recruiting goal for the year as of mid-July. The U.S. military needs a lot of people. The U.S. Army alone must get tens of thousands to sign up every year to replace those who leave the service. The Army had a goal of signing up 60,000 people this year, but according to the Secretary of the Army, they could end up close to 15,000 short of that goal.
Each sister service branch is going to also have to think about their retention tactics, whether it's offering enlistment bonuses or other incentives to keep people in our current military force.
One tool the military has in times like these are big cash bonuses. These bonuses usually apply to certain understaffed jobs and also have stipulations such as finishing training to be fully paid out. The Army is offering $40,000 for Special Forces candidates, and the Navy is offering bonuses that can range up to over $100,000 for eligible veterans to sign up. Keeping troops in who are looking to exit the service is another way to bolster numbers. The Marines have recently had some success in convincing people to stay in. A major hang-up to recruiting more new soldiers are the fitness and academic requirements.
Some services are struggling more than the others. The Army is certainly struggling the most. They're also the biggest, so that would just make sense. They're revisiting some of the fitness standards and some of the academic standards right now to try and scramble for the end of this fiscal year.
If you're going to be a cyber technician, do you really need to be able to lift X number of pounds and run 5 miles? I think over time we're going to have to target the expectations of our service members based on the kinds of jobs they're doing.
The military has found itself getting dragged into domestic politics more than in the past and in new ways.
Disproportionately, of the age group of American youth that we're talking about, the military recruits from certain geographical concentrations of America. It's more geographical than it is class or race or gender specific. And these areas tend to be more conservative.
Those that tend to be interested come from southern states where we have a lot of installations, and from families in which there has at least been one family member that serves. So 80% of our service members now have legacy in their background.
We're entering a space where more people on the right and more people on the left have more bones to pick with the military and the kind of life that they're going to have to live there.
You know, there's this perception about the military is going woke, and there are all these cultural wars inside the military. But to be honest with you, I'm not sure how much of that actually trickles down to that young 18-year-old recruit from middle America who's trying to decide what he or she wants to do to improve themselves and their future.
The state-by-state fight over abortion rights could also become a factor. Military personnel stationed in one state could have access to abortion rights while others may not.
There's a potential that you'll have some folks who are hesitant to join because they don't know if they're going to get sent somewhere where they don't have access to health care that they believe is a human right.
Every branch of the military is struggling to meet its recruiting goals this fiscal year. That from multiple military and defense officials and numbers obtained by NBC News. Last month, the Army Chief of Staff, General James McConville, testified before Congress. He said only 23% of Americans aged 17 to 24 are qualified to serve with a waiver to join. That's down from 29% in recent years. A military official tells us the military hasn't had such a hard time getting recruits in 50 years. Back then, Vietnam War and the draft were both ending. And while he doesn't believe a revival of the draft is coming, he does say the military will question the sustainability of the all-volunteer force this year. Here's NBC's Courtney Kuby.
And Shep, of those 23% of Americans who are eligible for service, this DoD survey found that only 9% of them are even considering entering the military. But that wasn't the only statistic that really stood out to me in this survey. Of these Americans who were asked about service in this key demographic, 57% said that they worried that if they served in the military, they would come out with either emotional or psychological problems. And nearly half of those surveyed said that they worried that they would come out with physical ailments. So the question is, what is the Pentagon going to do about it? Well, defense and military officials said that, first of all, they're looking at some of the more than 250 disqualifiers for service. Things like ADHD and asthma, that in the past, if a recruit had come in and had symptoms or any kind of problems with ailments like that in the last 5 to 10 years, they would be disqualified from serving without a waiver. Well, now the Pentagon is looking at whether they can shorten that period so someone may be able to enter military service without a waiver in cases like that and in some other military ailments. In addition to that, the military is now specifically targeting those influencers, parents, teachers, school guidance counselors to try to encourage them to help students to push them towards potentially entering a career in the military.
Is the military draft coming back? According to one expert,
is the military draft imminent? I would say no.
Tensions between the West and Russia taking center stage at the United Nations General Assembly in New York this weekend as the war in Ukraine surpasses the 7-month mark.
Hey, Lindsay, President Biden sent a stern warning to Russia last week when he spoke at the UN General Assembly, saying that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. But that warning hasn't stopped Moscow from continuing to flex its nuclear arm. And so the U.S. responded again today with a White House official telling Russia that any nuclear action on their part would be met with catastrophic consequences. The White House top national security advisor warned on Sunday that the U.S. would act decisively if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine.
We have communicated directly, privately, at very high levels to the Kremlin that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia, that the United States and our allies will respond decisively, and we have been clear and specific about what that will entail.
Addressing reporters at the UN in New York on Saturday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia's nuclear umbrella would extend to new territories annexed from Ukraine. He said the entire territory of the Russian Federation, which is enshrined and could be further enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, unquestionably is under the full protection of the state. That is absolutely natural. It's not the first time Moscow has sought to flex its nuclear arm. But on Sunday, Ukrainian President Zelensky said this time he's not sure President Putin is bluffing.
He wants to scare the whole world. These are the first steps of his nuclear blackmail. I don't think he's bluffing. I think the world is deterring it and containing this threat.
The talks of using nuclear weapons and the escalation of possible war. Will the U.S. draft be reinstated? What are your thoughts?
We don't have a draft. We haven't had a draft since the Vietnam War, so since the 70s. So you need to actually have a law passed that would actually start the draft.
she understands why people are so concerned about a possible draft.
I think most Americans that do remember the draft in the 70s and with all the connotations that come with it.
During the Vietnam era, the military draft was a fraught, highly contentious one.
A need for more manpower upon America's deeper involvement in the Vietnam War in 1965 made President Johnson bring in conscription. Now young men who are not considering military service would consider whether they might get picked to fight in the Vietnam conflict across the globe. While 2/3 of Americans volunteered during the Vietnam War, the other third would be drafted. All males aged 18 to 26 were required to register for the draft. The names of American men of draft age were recorded by the Selective Service System. When called out by the local draft board, which was often composed of veterans, he would be evaluated on whether he would be drafted in the military or not. The local board's decisions were often seen as unfair.
So family, let me share with you a little bit of this military history of African Americans in the Vietnam War and why it was so unfair how they handled the draft. So I'm sharing this with you guys. And it reads, African Americans played a prominent role in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the first American war in which black and white troops were not formally segregated, and even saw significant growth in the number of African Americans engaged in battlefield combat, though some de facto segregation still occurred. In essence, it was still racist. But let me go on. For those in the family who do not believe that this country is going to be responsible for and have to reap what has been sown for the discrimination of African Americans, but also other people of color, and for those who were less fortunate or with the lower incomes, on how they discriminated in their choice of who was going to be drafted to go to combat. It goes on to read, African Americans have always been involved in the United States military service since its inception, despite official policies of racial segregation and discrimination. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman abolished discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. By 1953, the final black-only unit was abolished. It goes on to say that black Americans were more likely to be drafted than white Americans. The Vietnam War saw the highest proportion of African American soldiers in the U.S. military up to that point. Though comprising 11% of the U.S. population in 1967, African Americans were 16.3% of all draftees. During the period of the Vietnam War, well over half of African American draft registrants were found ineligible for military service, compared with only 35 to 50% of white registrants. For example, in 1967, 29% of African Americans were found eligible for military services, compared to 63% of whites. The armed services drafted 64% of the eligible African American registrants, in comparison to 31% of the eligible white registrants. Project 100,000, which helped dramatically increase U.S. troop presence in Vietnam from 23,300 in 1965 to 465,600 2 years later. Let me read that again. It says Project 100,000, which helped dramatically increase U.S. troop presence in Vietnam from 23,300 in 1965 to 465,600 2 years later, sharply increased the number of African American troops drafted. By lowering the education standard of the draft, an estimated 40% of the 246,000 draftees of Project 100,000 were black. A total of 300,000 African Americans served in Vietnam. According to Daniel Lux, the reason behind the high turnout was the pay, which for many was more than they had ever made in their lives, and that young African Americans perceived military service as a vocational opportunity, and they had the additional incentive to enlist to prove on the battlefield that they were worthy of the newly acquired civil rights. Some activists in the U.S. speculated that the uneven application of the draft was a method of black genocide. From the years of 1966 to 1969, opinion of the draft grew increasingly negative. A 1966 poll from Newsweek found that 25% of African Americans thought of the law as unfair. A similar poll in 1969 saw the number rise to 47%. Black people were starkly underrepresented on draft boards in the era, with none of the draft boards of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, or Arkansas. In Louisiana, Jack Helms, a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, served on the draft board from 1957 until 1966. So is there any wonder why there is discrimination involved in the draft process during this time? So I'm going to go on to read. In 1966, 1/3 of the U.S. Draft Board members were African American, with only Delaware having a proportionate number of African American board members to the African American population. Here's more, family. Listen up.
Most of the men chosen were from poor and working class backgrounds, people of color, and people from rural towns and farming communities. Draft boards would frequently defer middle-class men, who they would see as having valuable futures, and the upper classes were barely drafted at all. There were many ways in which draftees could be deferred or exempt from the draft. For example, men who were medically unfit, men who were married with children, or students at college. Men who had held college deferments were eligible for induction until age 35, but as few men between the ages of 26 and 35 were ever drafted. They could maintain a college deferment until their 26th birthday and avoid service altogether. Some draft resistors could be put in jail for refusing to fight in the war. They broke the law by escaping the draft, by refusing to turn up to the local board or fleeing to Canada. Those who were opposed to the draft became known as draft dodgers. When the war started, they were seen as cowards, but as the war dragged on and opposition to the draft grew, public attitude was more sympathetic. The draft process changed in late 1969 to make it fairer as a result of the public discontent. A draft lottery was created where 366 blue plastic capsules, each containing a birth date in the year, were dumped into a large glass container.
December 6th. They had a lottery system based on year of birth. Then get a number assigned.
December 6th is 010.
And if your birth date was that number that was called up in a lottery, you would then be called to a draft and you would be sent to a local draft board. And they would then have the decision of whether you were physically and mentally fit and also morally fit to serve.
It wouldn't quite work the same way today.
The requirements actually to be in the military is significantly higher today than it was, I think, during the Vietnam War. The process by which I think it would also depend on sort of what skill set they need, sort of what kind of individual that they are looking for that would be able to serve in the military, because obviously our weapon systems are much more complex.
Wada says many people confuse the draft with registering for the selective service.
A lot of people have misinformation, or we conflate both registration and the draft as one. And they are sort of two distinct processes. One is that you are required as an 18 to 25-year-old male to register for a potential draft.
That's selective service.
And the second is more of a sort of once the legislation and law is passed, then the draft process begins.
If you're worried about the draft being reinstated in the U.S., here's what to look for.
First thing that you would see, and that should make people be concerned if there would be a draft, is if Congress actually passed legislation to enable a draft. Pay attention to what's going on, right? If you see dialogue happening about whether there are enough troops that are being sent, right? Because we have a volunteer force where we will see the activation of the services, in particularly the Army, maybe the Marine Corps. You'll see the activation of the reserve components and the National Guard, as we did after 9/11. But if we get to a draft draft, it is sort of a break glass. We need to, take out that fire extinguisher because we are being overwhelmed. I would like to think if we are actually unable to respond and our country is being attacked, right, by missiles, and if we needed a draft, that people would respond. And that would change the dynamic to guess about what the future holds.
And since a draft would need to be established by an act of Congress, voters and citizens would have a say.
Putin promises to bolster troops. Putin has announced a partial draft to raise numbers as current troops face heavy resistance in Ukraine. This has sparked protests across Russia, leading to hundreds of arrests. Russia is also planning voter referendums tomorrow, potentially leading to the annexation of 4 Russian-controlled regions of Ukraine.
Ukraine moved to ban all men aged 18 to 60 from leaving the country as martial law was imposed throughout Ukraine. That move led many to speculate that the country was preparing for a massive draft, but it's only reservists who have been actively drafted by the Ukrainian government at this time. That Ukraine could potentially be preparing for a mass draft of men aged 18 to 60 was reiterated on Friday when the Ukrainian parliament voted to approve in the first reading a draft law granting permission to Ukrainians to carry firearms and act in self-defense. As world leaders warn that this Russian invasion of Ukraine could spark World War III, it has a new generation of young people who have never fought in a war, wondering how potential further conflicts could influence their chances of getting drafted. Could the United States bring back the draft? Here's how the current law works. The United States federal government stopped the draft in 1973 after facing massive public backlash throughout the Vietnam War. 2 years after Congress chose to not reauthorize the draft, President Gerald Ford suspended men's responsibility to register for it altogether. However, in 1980, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and President Jimmy Carter reversed that position. He reinstated the registration, and since that time, all men who are permanent residents in the U.S. and are between the ages of 18 and 26 are required to register for the draft. However, according to the Selective Service System, that's the agency responsible for running the draft and registering men, an act of Congress could still reinstate the draft in case of a national emergency. Recently, Congress has considered proposals about the draft, which include requiring women to register for the draft and dismantling the draft system altogether.
So family, you and I have heard the Biden administration say any use of nuclear weapons by Russia will be met with catastrophic consequences. It was also said that the U.S. and their allies will respond decisively. It kind of sounds like a threat, but to some it might sound like a promise. However it's taken, we're on the road to war. And considering the recruitment crisis that's going on in America, it makes you wonder, will we reinstate the U.S. draft? That's the question. What are your thoughts?